Tim Matthews. Welcome to the On Adventure podcast. From our conversation a few days ago, I understand this is your very first podcast. Is that correct?
I think it is. Yes, it is. And happy to be here.
Good. Very good.
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear where we take this conversation.
Sure.
You and I met because of our mutual friend, Steve Sandusky, who I actually interviewed on this podcast back in episode 5. Steve's got some great stories, and I would encourage anybody to go back and listen to that. But I like to start, Tim, just by giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell folks who you are, where you're at, and what got you to that point.
Sure. Happy to do so. So I'm 66 years old as of last week. And,
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Just retired recently after third try. This time it's been successful. So I'm actually fully retired now, which is wonderful and loving it so far. I grew up as a Foreign Service brat. So my dad was in the Foreign Service. In fact, my grandfather was also in the Foreign Service.
Oh, wow.
So we moved around a lot. In fact, I was born in Switzerland, and we lived in Spain, Mexico, and Egypt while I was growing up. Went to high school in northeastern Connecticut. Last 2 years, I was at a prep school up there because my parents were fixing to go overseas. And then ended up at the University of Colorado and ended up getting a degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Colorado. I went out there to experience the mountains and ski and backpack and all that good stuff. And after college, took a job with a defense contractor. This was during the Reagan years, the big defense buildup. And so jobs were plentiful in that industry. And after about a year, I got bored and ended up joining the Navy. So I spent the next 32 years in uniform as a aeronautical maintenance duty officer. So I spent a lot of time on aircraft carriers and in the various facilities on both coasts. Did a tour in Spain as well. And then ended up in the Pentagon. The Navy found out that I had been in the service 29 years and had not been in the Pentagon. So they said, it's your turn. So I learned a lot there, but ended up retiring out of the Pentagon in 2014. Then I went to work for Lockheed Martin for a while on the F-35 program. I lived in Fort Worth, left my family up here in Maryland and lived in Fort Worth for a while. And that brought me to where we are today, living here in Southern Maryland. I do spend quite a bit of time out in Montana. That's where my mom lived until she passed away. And I have a sister, a couple of nieces, brother-in-law out there now. So we try to make it out there a few times a year.
Which part of Montana?
Missoula, Montana. It's a wonderful town. It's college town, of course. That's where the University of Montana is. And it's nestled into the mountains. And in fact, we look out our back door and there is Mount Sentinel, which is a wonderful place to hike and climb. It's wonderful.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And first of all, thank you for your service. That is quite the record. And I'm sure you hit many different parts of the world doing that, but I personally am very grateful for that. And now, tell me what position, maybe this isn't the right way to ask it as a non-military guy, but when you retired, at what point or what position were you at that point?
My last job was called the resource officer for fleet readiness. So I had about $24 billion to dispense to the operating fleets. So if you think about what it costs to operate ships and airplanes and submarines, that was all my budget. So we had to determine how to split that up and of course defend the budget every year against people that wanted to take our money away. So all the ship's maintenance, aircraft maintenance, steaming hours, petroleum products, all that, and also the expeditionary forces too. So I was a one-star admiral at the Pentagon at that point, working for a three-star admiral. The joke is that the one-stars make the coffee for the three stars up there in the Pentagon. So
I'm sure it's a little more than that.
Well, it's a little more than that, but it's quite something working up there. Yeah. But I learned a heck of a lot.
That's cool. And I mean, that job sounds like you've got to be able to have your operational wits about you to be able to handle something that large. Is that kind of detail natural for you, or is that nurtured into you through all your years in the Navy?
Well, certainly my experience in the Navy is what led me to that job, and it would be very difficult for somebody to try to jump into a job like that without having all that experience. But I have a pretty good eye for numbers. I have an engineering background, and there are, the spreadsheets that you have to deal with up there are incredibly dense, as you can
Mm,
imagine, with all the
yeah.
budget numbers in them and all that. But it's also a matter of trying to balance priorities there and doing the very best job that you can, given that, there's various factions within the Navy that are all screaming for their piece of the pie so they can
Hmm.
execute their mission. And you don't want to cut somebody back to the point where they can't execute their mission. So, it takes a lot of skill and coordination to make sure that the budget dollars you have are applied where they can have the most benefit for fleet readiness.
Yeah, it
So
seems like a massive undertaking.
it was, yeah, it
Yeah.
was.
And so I'm a financial planner by day. That's my main job. These podcasts are kind of something I enjoy doing in addition to that. But my business partner is a CPA, and he calls the folks that are really good at spreadsheets, us being in that category, that we're just a bunch of spreadsheet monkeys. And you got to be
Yeah,
a
that's a good
really
term.
good spreadsheet monkey to handle what you just described.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Yeah. I don't know how
great.
they did it before spreadsheets, actually, with pencil and paper. It's hard to imagine.
That is
Yeah.
hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, so that's a kind of a great timeline of what got you to sitting on the looking over the Potomac in Southern Maryland right now. I think it's interesting to maybe way to phrase a summary of that, but if you could maybe title the chapters or the book of your life to this point, how would you summarize your life? And I won't lead the question any more than that, but how would you summarize your life?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mentioned I was a Foreign Service brat. So, one of the challenges I had as a youngster was, all the moves that we had. We moved around every 3 years. So it means making new friends every few years. But, what comes with that is a certain amount of adaptability. But I was a pretty wild youth through college. I did my share of partying and had a lust for adventure starting at an early age, but had very little self-discipline. And when I joined the Navy, and I joined the Navy because I essentially was bored at my job in the defense industry and wanted some adventure. So I joined the Navy and I certainly got it. But that gave me the self-discipline to be successful, I think.
Hmm.
The Navy turned my life around in that regard. Heck, I'd probably be either dead or in jail if it wasn't for the Navy. So I'm I'm very, very gratified that I had that experience. And I've always thought of, and I got this from my father, a sense of service and giving back, in this case to our country. And I was very focused on that. And that's what just kept me driving through my Navy career. There were several points where I thought, I can't take this anymore. I'm getting out. I'm going to go do something else. But I just kept coming back to wanting to serve. And I got a lot of reward out of that along the way. So it was challenging, but it was also very rewarding. And I think the arc of my life has been one of some bumps along the road as an adolescent, but then getting some mission and some focus in the service, and then carrying that through the rest of my life, really.
Hmm.
I'm a real believer in habits, and I think you are what your habits are to a large degree. And to the extent that I've been able to develop some good habits, I mean, there's certainly bad ones out there too, but in particular with keeping in good physical condition. So, that if I was to zero in on one habit that I have that has helped me through all the years, and that would be just maintaining a good physical condition by working out, almost daily. And that helps with, body, mind, and spirit. But,
Yeah.
that's one thing that's been a constant in my life ever since, even before I joined the Navy.
Even before the Navy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even before the Navy.
Yeah. And we'll
And
get
that was
into
driven by climbing. So, yeah.
Yeah, that I want to definitely talk about some of those adventures or escapades, however you want to look at it, prior to getting into the Navy, and then how that continued on. But I think that's a really good, helpful summary to dig in a little bit deeper into your life growing up. And as a kid that moved around several times, myself included in that, I'm curious what that type of moving through your adolescence years, what was that like for you?
Well, it's exciting, but also challenging. You make these friends and, especially as an adolescent, but even as a preteen, your friends are kind of your life. They're everything to you.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and when you have to break those friendships and, you're not just moving across town, you're moving out of the country. So, and this was way before social media or email or anything. So there wasn't a whole lot of contact. If you wanted to stay in contact, you'd write letters. So, you'd break these friendships and you'd have to make new ones. And showing up at a new school with absolutely no friends, can be a tough thing, particularly for an adolescent. So I was in, let's see, I did eighth, ninth, 10th grade in Mexico City, and then had to leave there in 10th grade and go up to Connecticut where I knew nobody. But,
How did you cope with those transitions and get settled in a new social circle? How'd you do that?
yeah, well, I mean, at the end of the day, you just have to do it. You don't have a choice. But, you develop a certain amount of adaptability having done this all my life. It becomes, I won't say normal business, but you're expecting it to happen. You know that at this point in time, you're going to be leaving. So you're sort of mentally preparing for that, you know, 6 months to a year before it's going to happen. So you sort of steel yourself for the fact that you're going to have to leave. But, you got to sever all those emotional bonds with your
Hmm.
friends. And that is tough. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah.
But, you get through it and you make new friends. And in fact, you become pretty good at making new friends.
Hmm.
It's sort of a sink or swim thing, right?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So, one of the questions I like to ask is, what would be the first big challenge you could think that you overcame as a kid? Maybe you have something that pops into mind other than this, but I mean, it would seem to me that adapting that many times and reinventing yourself that many times would in and of itself be a giant challenge that you were forced to figure out at a very early age. Is there anything else that comes to mind as, some really large metaphorical mountain that the first that you can remember?
Well, that was the biggest challenge, of course, is just the amount of moving around we had to do. But, we weren't destitute by any means. The government paid my father enough to get by on pretty handsomely. So, we didn't have any significant monetary challenges as I was growing up, and I'm very grateful for that. My dad did get stationed in Vietnam during the war at the embassy in Hanoi, and so I spent a couple years in Spain without my dad there, and my mom had to sort of take up the slack, and that was rather difficult.
Yeah,
Um,
I would imagine that was
yeah.
pretty tough.
Or excuse me, I think I said Hanoi. That's absolutely the wrong place. It would have been Saigon.
Mm,
Yeah,
gotcha.
Hanoi was North Vietnam. No,
Yeah, he
Saigon.
probably wasn't there.
Was not in the embassy there. Yeah, that's where unfortunately John McCain was spending his time.
Mm, certainly.
Yeah.
So, kind of tying this into what I know you and I talked about a few days ago in leading up to this conversation, but where did your outdoor adventure side come out and when did you really get into some of this kind of love for rock climbing?
Well, that would have really started in Mexico. I had a friend who was 2 years older than I was. I think he was a junior while I was in ninth grade. He had gone to Outward Bound in Colorado, and I really looked up to this guy. And our parents were friends, so we got kind of connected. And he had started climbing the two volcanoes that are outside of Mexico City, Popocatépetl and Ixtaccíhuatl, the two Indian named volcanoes down there, both over 17,000 feet. And he invited me to come along. And so I guess I was about 14, 13 or 14 when I started climbing them. It was physically the hardest thing I had ever done. The summit was the first mountain we summited down there. And it's glaciated, so you need ice axe crampons. And on most of the routes, you need to rope up. Incidentally, you can't climb Popo now because it's an active volcano,
Hmm.
but back then it was dormant, even though it had a huge crater, and you look down in the crater and all this sulfur and steam was coming up out of it. It's a pretty amazing sight. But yeah, that got me started, gave me a real love for the outdoors and backpacking. We ended up climbing both of those volcanoes, and then we went over and climbed the Pico de Orizaba, which is over near Veracruz, Mexico. And that's close to 19,000 feet, I think.
And this is all as a like middle and early high school?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Wow.
this was all when I was a freshman and sophomore in high school.
Okay.
Yeah. So
It
instead
sounds
of
like
playing
you,
football and soccer and those things, I was up climbing mountains. That's
hmm,
just where my interest led me to. So
that's interesting.
it was wonderful.
And and it's interesting to me that I mean what you just described sounds like you jumped into the deep end of the pool, right? I mean, roping up and ice axes and that's not just like getting started on a little trail that goes up a big mountain. You jumped into the difficult stuff right out of the gate and we're able to do it. I'm sure that gave you some confidence in your abilities in the outdoors doing these kind of things.
Yeah, I think it did. And this mentor I was telling you about, David Horton is his name. He was very proficient and he was extremely confident in his abilities, and some of that rubbed off on me. And I'm grateful to him to this day for introducing me to that. In fact, I'm still doing a bit of climbing. Steve and I actually climbed Mount Olympus last summer, and I sent David Horton a few notes and pictures and told him, "Hey, thanks for getting me into this. I'm still loving it." He
That's
got a big
cool.
kick out of that. Yeah.
Is he still climbing?
He's not. Unfortunately, he had an accident some years ago falling off a roof, and that was the end of his climbing career, unfortunately.
I
But
would imagine
yeah,
so.
yeah. Now the other thing that I experienced in Mexico, I love to climb, but I also love to dive. And I think it was 71, my father and I and my sister and mom, we all went on vacation to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, and I really had been hankering to go scuba diving since I saw Thunderball, which was a James Bond movie that came around that time, and it had a lot of underwater scenes that I thought were really cool. So I really wanted to try that. And it turns out that they were offering scuba diving down there, scuba lessons. So I convinced my dad to sign up. And so we met the instructor. He threw us in the pool, gave us a few tips on how to breathe with the apparatus underwater. And after, I don't know, 20 minutes of that, he threw us in this rubber Zodiac, and out we went in the open ocean. And the three of us went down and dove, I don't know, 45 feet maybe, not real deep, but for a first dive, it was pretty deep, and I instantly loved it. I
Hmm.
just, the sense of sort of weightlessness that you feel down there, and then seeing all the brilliant fish and all the other sea life down there, it's another world. It's just amazing. And to this day, I have a real passion for it. But my dad ran out of air, and back then when you ran out of air, you just pulled this J valve and it gave you another 500 psi. He popped up to the surface. He was kind of a big guy, a smoker. He had had enough of it. And when I came up with my instructor, he had an octopus stuck on his arm. And boy, I can still remember that. He peeled the tentacles of the octopus off, and he still had these suction marks on his forearm.
Oh my
I
gosh.
just thought that was the coolest thing. And then I wanted to go again, and my dad said, no, I've had enough of this. But the instructor said, well, I'll take you tomorrow. So we showed up at the beach, and he gave me my gear, and then he said, well, I got to go run a few errands. Just, you can go off. Just don't go very far, and then just leave your gear back here. Well, so I went diving by myself at age 13.
Oh my gosh. Day 2 of ever doing this.
Of ever doing it. And
13 years old.
the first thing you learn when you get certified is never dive without a buddy. And so I was violating that cardinal rule right off the bat, but I didn't know it better. So
Yeah.
yeah, that was my introduction to diving.
And you obviously survived.
I survived. Yeah.
Yeah.
Equipment was very rudimentary back then too, of course. But yeah,
And you
I survived. And
you still do dives at this point as well?
I do. I love to dive. Don't do any around here. The visibility is terrible here in the Potomac River. So I've become sort of a warm water, high visibility diver now. But
Where's your favorite?
I really like the Cayman Islands. The reef is in good shape down there, and there's a lot of dive sites. In fact, we're going back down there in June to do some more diving. So that is a wonderful place to dive. There's some walls that go down, hundreds of feet, and lots of good marine life, sharks, if you like some sharks, moray eels, and lots of tropical fish. It's just wonderful.
Have you ever had like any close encounter or dangerous encounter with something like a shark while you're underwater?
Well, yeah, we in Hawaii, we did my first night dive. We were out and off of Maui, this volcano called Molokai, I think it is. So you dive in the crater of this volcano that's out there, that sticks up out of the water. It's a great place to dive because the coral reef that's formed in the caldera of this volcano is just amazing. But we did a night dive, and you see all kinds of different things at night down there, of course. Then you have lights on, and all you can see is what your light is illuminating. But the tiger shark came along, and after we'd been down about 20 minutes, our dive master said, we're out of here. So, none of us got bit or hurt or anything, but that's not what you want to see, tiger sharks.
Those are pretty big, right?
They're pretty big, and they can be pretty aggressive as well.
Yeah.
So, you typically want to get out of the water if you see one of those. But I've been in the water with bull sharks, and gray reef sharks is what you typically see down in the Cayman Islands, and they'll swim all around you, and they don't bother you. But they're pretty big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's enough reason for me not to want to do it.
No, you should do it. It's a wonderful sport. It's
Okay.
amazing. Yeah.
Have you ever done any dives around there's a small Caribbean island called Saba, not too far from St. Martin's?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I haven't dove there. I've dove in Bonaire, in St. Thomas, Cozumel, Honduras, and the Caymans. Oh, and St. Croix.
St. Croix. Gotcha.
Yeah, but not there, no. But there's a lot of good diving there.
Interestingly enough, episode 7, the actually one of our clients, Lenny Colbreth, I interviewed her. She runs a small dive operation and bed and breakfast in Bonaire called the Carib Inn. And
okay.
So her uncle started it back in the 70s. He apparently is kind of, I don't know, world famous, very famous for running the Carib Inn and the dive operation. But you should check her out for sure. They've got a pretty cool thing going there. And again, apparently Bonaire is one of the best places in the world to do dives like that.
It is. In fact, we went down and spent a week in Bonaire. Forgot to mention that one. But didn't stay there. Stayed at, I don't know, a place called Dive Buddy, I think it's called.
Dive Buddy.
But yeah, that driving is great down there.
Very cool. So you mentioned this earlier, you kind of got into a new high school prior to college. I'm curious how, the adventure seed that started as a middle school, early high schooler doing, climbing volcanoes in Mexico, did that continue even as you moved, or did that go sit on the shelf for a little while until you pulled it back down at some point later?
Yeah, it would be the latter. I definitely had a passion for it, but there's not a whole lot of mountains in Connecticut, Eastern Connecticut. There's certainly some hiking to be done. So I did continue with backpacking and whatnot. And then when I ended up going to the University of Colorado, I picked it back up and did some climbing.
Oh yeah.
But I also, I love to ski, and that that was a passion as well, and did some backpacking. But once I joined the Navy, the opportunities were much more limited, particularly if I was out on a ship for extended periods. Was so some of these things I just kind of had to put on the shelf, as you put it. And in the case of climbing, I sort of did a hiatus for, oh gosh, probably 20 years or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
That's a
well,
big break.
maybe 10 years. I did a lot of hiking and backpacking, but no snow ice climbing until I was stationed up in Whidbey Island, Washington. And a high school friend of mine who was living in Portland said, "Hey, why don't you come on down here and let's climb Mount Hood?" And I said, "Really? Okay, that sounds interesting." And I still had my old ice axe and crampons.
Did you really?
I did, yeah, from when I was in Mexico. I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll come down there." And that just reignited it all over again. That was probably 2000 when I was stationed up there in Washington State. So after that, I started climbing the volcanoes down there. I've attempted Rainier 8 times, and I have summited 4 times. So I'm at about 50% rate with Rainier. That mountain's incredible. It creates its own weather. So all 4 times that I didn't make it, it was all because of wind or snow conditions or whiteout condition in one case. But yeah, then that's where I met Steve. I was on Mount Adams.
On Mount Adams.
Yeah,
Okay.
Steve Sandusky. Wonderful person and a great climbing partner. So
That's cool.
we kind of connected on a glacier seminar at Mount Adams, and then went on from there and did, I don't know, I think we're up to 5 or 6 climbs together now.
What do you think it is about these outdoor pursuits, whether it's diving underwater or climbing a mountain or just backpacking? What do you think it is about them that has such a draw for you?
Yeah, I think it grounds me to be in nature. And I think I mentioned I spent quite a bit of time on ships. That's definitely not the natural world. So stepping away from that and being able to get out with your feet on the ground in a natural environment, to me, it's a meditative and very spiritual experience. It brings me a lot of serenity and calm, even if it's in a difficult situation. And I love the physicality of it. The challenge of climbing and backpacking physically is exhilarating. But just being out in nature for me is kind of what I live for these days.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm certainly not the only one that feels that way. I think a lot
No,
of
I think
have that
there's,
connection.
I hear it over and over again, but there's a string that it pulls to, it's almost, you can't help but stand with a sense of awe at how small we are and how big everything else is. And that is grounding. It's, I think there's something about the human brain where that just puts us in our right place and it feels pretty good. And I don't know that you can, I mean, maybe some people get it in other ways, but it happens for me. I mean, what you just described is the reason I do outdoor stuff, because it happens every single time, like
Right,
clockwork. And
right.
I can't get that necessarily reading a book or running around my neighborhood or anything like that. It's got to be something bigger than that. So, and it's interesting. I mean, so some of the things you've done are really, really have been physically difficult. Is there any that come to mind that when you were in the middle of them that you said, this is stupid, I should not be doing this, this is way too hard or dangerous? Was there any moments where you felt like you took it just a tad bit too far?
Well, yeah, I'd have to say, being frightened or on edge for me is part of the experience.
Mm,
And, you know, every climb I do, there's an element of that. If it's a particularly steep traverse, for example, or a vertical pitch that we're doing, well, the adrenaline really starts kicking in. And sometimes I'll think, wow, this is way beyond me. I'm not sure I can hack this, but I end up doing it and I push through. And boy, you talk about exhilaration at the other end of that. You really feel like you've accomplished something and you push through your fears. And it just gives you a great sense of accomplishment and pride and gratitude for being able to do it.
yeah.
But the key to being able to do all that, of course, is preparation.
Yeah.
And so I never approach any of these climbs without being in top physical condition, or I wouldn't go. And part of that is because I want to make sure I make it, but I also don't want to jeopardize by not being in adequate physical condition to do it. So I'll
Hey,
train quite a bit for any substantial climb like that. And a lot of that is just getting on the stair stepper with a heavy pack on and going for 45 minutes, an hour and a half, and then doing some running and other cardiovascular exercise to make sure that I am in shape, because that gives you the confidence that you can push through and make the summit, so that there won't be a physical limitation. Now, there could be a skill level that you don't have, but the climbs that I am doing these days, I mitigate the risk by going with a guide service. Back in the old days when I was down in Mexico and in Colorado, I never hired guys to do it. I just got a map and did it on my own. But when you get to be my age, for one thing, I'm blessed with the resources to be able to do that and hire a guide service, but it's also a matter of risk reduction
yeah.
to have somebody that's been on the route before.
Yeah. I
Guide.
mean, you still got to do it. They're
Yeah.
not doing the climb for you,
No,
but
absolutely not.
yeah. And does the training, basically at sea level on the stair stepper and doing some running, how well does that translate when to being ready when you get to elevation?
Well, it certainly helps. I mean, your cardiovascular condition is better as a result of the training. You're able to get more, oxygen to the tissues as a result. But there's no real way to experience altitude unless you're at altitude. There's some devices that some folks try to put on that restrict the airflow
I've
and
seen
the
that.
oxygen. I don't I don't buy that, so I haven't been using any of those devices. The best way to do it is to go someplace with some altitude. So you can go to Colorado, or I mentioned I spent some time in Montana, so
Mm.
I'll go running up there and do some hiking up there, and that helps. But it's still a challenge getting, once you get up to 12,000 and then 13,000 feet. Yeah, it's there's
Do you
there's
just
no way
give
around
yourself
that.
enough lead time going into one of these trips to acclimate before you really start getting on the mountain?
Well, that's kind of difficult with a mountain like Rainier. Seattle is where you fly into, and that's sea level, right? And so by the time you start climbing, you're not that high. That's one of the challenges with Rainier is the starting point is what, 6,000 to 7,000 feet, I think, something like that, at Paradise. and then you're going up from there. When we did Olympus this last July, a wonderful climb because it goes through the Hoh rainforest, but you're starting just about at sea level down there. Now, Mount Olympus isn't that high. It's less than, it's 9,000 feet or something. So you're not getting up into the 14s there, but the amount of elevation gain is still about the same as climbing Rainier, and you've got a 20-mile hike into the start of the actual climb. So, and that's with a pretty heavy pack.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, what I'll do is, several months before a climb like that, I'm going to up my game. I try to maintain a pretty high level of fitness all the time, but then I'll up the game and get on the stair stepper, do some longer runs, and then try to boost my cardiovascular capability and capacity. And that way that's one of the things you won't have to stress out and worry about as you're leading up to this climb, and then you're getting on it. Because
Gotcha.
there's a certain amount of anxiety that you're going to have going into any endeavor like that. And if you don't have to worry about your physical condition, that's huge.
Do you have a trip coming up that you're training for?
Well, no, I don't have a specific trip. I think I'm going to take my son perhaps up Mount Baker, because he and I did Olympus last year, did Rainier in 2017. I've gotten him pretty excited about climbing, and he wants to go again. So I think we'll try Mount Baker. I've done that, but he hasn't done it. And
how many kids do you have?
I have 2 kids.
Okay.
And yeah.
How old are they?
Harrison is 31 now, I think, and he's a doctor going through his residency down at Duke in North Carolina. And then my daughter is 28, I think. Yeah, 28. And she's about to get married next week, so we're all excited about that. Yep, she lives down in Charleston, South Carolina.
That's also a nice place to live.
It is. Beautiful place. Yep.
Very cool. And it was outdoor activities something that you kind of tried to instill in your kids, or have you seen that carry over to them?
Absolutely. We did a lot of camping, most of it car camping. But when they were growing up, we went camping quite a bit. We lived out in Washington State, and then when we lived in Florida, North Florida, for quite a while, and got my son into scouts, and we'd go camping every week or every month. And then I sent Harrison to Outward Bound in the Sierras.
Oh, wow.
Because I really wanted him to have that experience. So yeah, he definitely shares the love of the outdoors. Annie, not quite as much, but she holds her own. She's gone backpacking in Glacier National Park with us. And we took her backpacking in Florida. And she likes to camp as well. So she has a good appreciation for it. Maybe not quite as passionate as Harrison has, but yeah.
So Harrison being in the middle
Mhm.
of his residency, he probably doesn't have a ton of extra time to do much at this point.
No, he doesn't, but he's about to get out of that. He's taking a job up in Brooklyn as a hospitalist. But he had enough time to take a week off and climb Mount Olympus with us.
Oh, cool.
He manages to squeeze a weekend here and there to go backpacking with his buddies down there in North Carolina as well. So
yeah, he's from where I'm sitting right now, he's maybe 20 miles.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, he's not far down the road. And from where he's at, living in Durham, I mean, within 2 or 3 hours in several directions, you can get some pretty great backpacking spots.
Yeah, in fact,
that's cool.
we went down to Linville Gorge.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We backpacked through there. That was beautiful.
Yeah, hard to believe something like that's in the middle of the North Carolina mountains, but it's really cool. and there's Linville Falls that kind of is at one end of it that
Right.
leads out to it, and some great backpacking for sure.
Yeah, we had we went there in November, and we thought the weather was going to be pretty balmy, but we woke up and it was 20 some degrees one day.
Mm,
Yeah. Hey, that's part of the fun of it.
that is, yeah,
You
for
know,
sure. Were you camping at that point, or were you just
we
kind of
were
exploring?
backpacking. Yeah,
Okay,
camping.
yeah. So
Yeah.
you were feeling the elements.
Feeling the elements. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all part of it. You know.
North Carolina weather is strange because it'll be cold-ish in the winter, but inevitably you're pretty much going to hit a 70-degree day almost every single month of the year, which is, I think, pretty unusual. So even if it does get cold, just wait a few days, it's going to change
And it'll warm
and
up, right?
it'll warm up. Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
well, very good. I'm curious about how these outdoor exploits have encouraged you, if you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but of ways that you've kind of challenged yourself or pushed yourself internally, you know, whether it be some of your physical training or emotionally or spiritually, just has your confidence outdoors affected you on your inside life, so to speak?
Yeah, I would have to say absolutely. It goes both ways though, right? So
Mm,
my confidence in the outdoors is also affected by how much physical conditioning I'm able to do prior to getting
certainly.
out there.
Yeah.
So there's that element of it. But yeah, if you're feeling down on yourself or you're stuck in a rut, I can look back and think of some of the fabulous experiences I've had in the wilderness, climbing mountains, doing solo backpacking trips in Glacier National Park. I've done several of those. That place is absolutely amazing. And, I think back on those things and it really can help turn my perspective around and my attitude. If I'm in a place where I'm either frustrated, feeling down about something, there's always those memories that come back. And those are priceless,
Mm,
memories. And there's no way to get them other than going out and doing it,
yeah.
So
Do you
yeah,
find a sense of kind of clarity in your everyday life when you're out, kind of removed from society for a little while?
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
Is it?
even to really sink into it, you got to be out there for a few days,
Yeah.
but, and, I've taken several solo backpacking trips, either because I wanted to, I felt like I wanted to be off by myself, and being by yourself in the wilderness is a transformative experience.
Mm,
It really makes you think about who you are and your place in the world. So I've done it because of that, and I've also done it because nobody else wanted to go. And darn it, I'm going anyway. So it's been both intentional and non-intentional.
I
But
love that.
being out in a place like Glacier National Park with its beauty, but also there's a lot of grizzlies about, and you on your own, and I don't carry a weapon other than a Swiss Army knife. I do carry bear spray. You
Yeah.
really have to up there. So you're a bit on edge all the time.
Yeah.
You have to be. But that in itself helps build confidence, but also, a lot of self-awareness. And
Have you
that,
had any close encounters with something like a grizzly?
yeah, I've seen two grizzlies in the wild up there.
They can be
One,
pretty aggressive, right?
they can be, yeah. Generally not. And if you look at the statistics, your likelihood of getting attacked by a grizzly is pretty low. But it's happened. In fact, it happened. My niece had a pretty rough experience out there with a grizzly. one of her friends getting mauled. She had to
Oh
whip
no.
out the bear spray and get the mama bear off of her friend, which is
Oh my gosh.
pretty amazing. But generally that doesn't happen. That happened because this particular, person wasn't all that smart about getting in between mama and the cubs. So
You don't ever
you
do
got to be
that.
smart about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I've had a few bear experiences. One in Yosemite with black bears that came into the camp and ended up robbing the food and stuff. But I wasn't really alarmed or scared at any of those points because I didn't feel like the bear was threatening me. I gave it plenty of space,
Yeah.
and I had my hand on the bear's feet. But,
Yeah.
you know,
And being in that far in the back country as consistently as you have you ever had a sense that I've heard people say this before that a sense of being watched, that you don't see any predator out there or animal, but just a sense that you're not by yourself?
yeah, you're always thinking there's probably a bear around this next corner, or worse yet, a mountain lion,
Yeah.
cougar. I'm actually more frightened of the mountain lions than I am of
Yeah.
even grizzly bears because they're very stealthy and you don't know they're there. But
Yep.
yeah, I mean, sometimes you start getting the creeps about, I'm sure there's something in that bush over there or around that bend. And then it
Yeah.
turns out there's nothing there, of course. But it does keep you on edge. But
Yeah.
that's a good thing.
Yep. I've got a buddy that grew up in Utah, and after a while he went to college. His dad was in Montana, and they're a big hunter. And he tells a story about going out bow hunting one day into the mountains. Didn't see anything, didn't kill anything, and was on his way back to the house, and just had that sense that I was saying that something's not right. I'm not. I don't feel like I'm by myself. But everywhere he looked, he see nothing. Right. I mean, just no movement. Didn't hear anything. And eventually he got to a kind of a bend, got behind some bushes where he could hide and turn around and look back where he had come from. And a little while later, after he had been sitting there a while, he saw a mountain lion kind of coming down the
Wow.
same path. And darn it if he didn't let that thing get close enough that he shot it with his bow.
Wow. He shot a mountain lion with his bow. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the family that my buddy comes from, that's a different kind of stock. His granddad grew up moving cattle up and down the West, and
Hmm.
real life cowboys for sure. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't suggest trying to wait for a mountain lion to get close enough to you to shoot it with a bow. That's usually
Yeah.
not a good life choice.
Not good head work, really.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So very good. Well, so
Yeah.
tell me as we kind of bring it all around. I'm curious. You said you just turned 66, correct?
I did. Yep.
And
Last
you
week.
are now fully retired,
Right.
but still, so you've got time on your hands and still physically fit. What in the next 10 years, what are the types of things that you want to continue to check off your list?
Well, I think I still got a few climbs in me, and I'm going to continue to pursue that as long as my body will allow it.
Mhm.
So I don't have any significant injuries. Of course, my knees are creaking a bit, shoulders, but I'm still running. I do some CrossFit and some strength exercises just to keep my joints working. So I think I'm good for a few more climbs. My darling wife of 40 years, Beth, and I have some travel plans ahead. We're going to go kayaking in the Sea of Cortez in April, and then we're going diving in the Caymans, and then we're going down the Salmon River in June. So we got our
Wow.
dance card is pretty full. So yeah, I've got most of the travel we do is adventure related. So I can see myself continuing to do a bunch of those things.
It seems to me that rock climbing for any of us would have kind of an expiration date of at some point, all of us are not physically able to do certain things. Is that a fair statement that at some point you just won't be able to do rock climbing anymore? And if that's true, how will you continue to pursue this, the sense of awe and the groundedness that you said that you get from being outside?
Yeah, good question. Certainly there's an expiration date. I'm not as strong as I used to be. I think the alpine climbing, the snow and ice, takes more physical stamina than anything else. So I think I got a few more years in that. But there's other things that start impacting you, like your reaction to cold. So, my circulation is not what it was when I was a youngster. And so even just going skiing, my hands will get cold. When I'm climbing, my feet will get pretty darn cold when you're on the glacier. So,
Yeah, that makes sense.
would I like to do Denali? Yes, I would. And, my apprehension about doing that is not so much that I couldn't do it physically. It's whether I'd be able to endure the cold on my feet and my extremities, because that's important. And if you can't function because your hands are just, oh, that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's all those limitations. But I can still get enjoyment out of an afternoon hike, even here in Southern Maryland. There's some beautiful places in the woods or along the river. So I just have to scale back my expectations. And, I have every intention of continuing to backpack until either my back won't hack it anymore or my knees or my legs. But yeah, once I can't do that anymore, I'll go car camping and do a bunch of day hikes.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways to get your wilderness fix without having to be extreme about it.
Yeah.
And so those folks that got a demanding job, that have to work all the time, or that are out on a ship for 6 months, you just got to take it where you can and take it, seize the day. And if there's an opportunity for you to take off for an afternoon or a day and do a hike, I would jump up and go for it. Because if you're waiting around for the perfect opportunity, you're going to lose out.
Yeah. I've got a buddy that is in the middle of raising kids right now, and that busy time of life, but he still wants to do these kind of adventures in his own way. And he said for him, he just picks it off when he can.
That's what you got to do.
Think of it as like fruit off a tree. You just grab it while you can, move on, and it may not be the big grand thing that you're shooting for, but you piece a few of those things together, and you got a pretty good thing. And
that's right.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things you can actually do with your kids that are fun and exhilarating. They're not going to be as risky, obviously. Wouldn't want them to be, but like I said, we did a lot of camping with our kids, got out in nature, a lot of hikes, some of them with my son in the backpack. And then you can run with them in those running strollers. Yeah. You just have to make adjustments.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is it's got to be a value. It's got to be something that's really important to you, and then you work life around that value. And I see people doing that. I also see people getting, and myself included at times, of just sucked into the so busy that nothing else can fit in. And that's an exhausting way to live.
It is.
I love what you're saying to make it a priority, and like I said, pick it off when you can. That is a great way to look at it.
Yeah, I think when I was in the Navy, you get 30 days of leave every year. That includes weekends and stuff because you're always on duty. But I had a lot of friends that would hardly ever take their leave, and they had hundreds of days of leave built up. You can only roll over so much from year to year. I don't remember what the precise regs on it are, but I took my 30 days every year.
Did you?
Absolutely. And I guess I was fortunate enough to have bosses that said, yeah, of course, you got it coming to you. You can take it. So I would take all 30 days every year to do something. And you really got to do that, in my mind, to refresh yourself
Yeah.
and to center yourself. And when you come back, you're feeling a lot better about your job. You're not as burnt out, especially if you're doing something in nature, in the wilderness, or something that's absolutely different from your day-to-day job, whether it be in an office or on a ship. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really helpful that just as a reminder, especially for anybody that listens to this podcast, I'm stacking up conversations about people that do these cool things, right? And you could almost get the sense that, well, the people that are doing this are doing these things all the time. And that's not the case. I mean, most of us and what I'd like to call the everyday explorer, we have real jobs, things that we fill our days with doing other than getting outside. But the adventure part, as you just put it, it gives that sense of grounding and stability when we get to the majority of what we spend our time on. It gives us the ability to get through it. And then it allows us to look forward to when we get away from it to be recharged so that we can do it all over again. It seems very symbiotic. And just like it would be unhealthy to never pursue an adventure or stretching ourselves, it I don't know, it may be unhealthy if that's all we did, right?
Sure.
Kind of like too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So I love the way you put that it gives the kind of the balance to be able to do well in both of those areas of life. And so I think that's great advice.
Yeah, I mean, climbing was certainly not my profession. I am still a big amateur. There are guys that do this as a profession,
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy Chin, Conrad Anker, and those guys.
Yep. Yep.
I admire the heck out of them, but that's their job. That's what they have chosen to do as a profession. And those of us in, I guess I would call the real world, that have actual, 9 to 5 type jobs that we've got to do, don't have that luxury. But that doesn't mean we can't experience the same kind of satisfaction and exhilaration about being outside in the wilderness. And, part of my philosophy has been, you know, if you get in a big rut and you've got your head down doing this job that can be very, very challenging and all consuming, you gotta lift your head once in a while and say, okay, next summer or in June, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this climb and I'm signing up for it. Make the commitment,
Hmm.
whether it's put down that deposit on the vacation. And, once you've done that and you've committed, then you're going.
Yeah.
And it can
Especially
be,
once you tell somebody that you're going to do it.
and you
Now,
tell somebody you're going to do it, sure. And you can feel, a little anxious about it. And then, that it's approaching. So, oh, I can't possibly do this because I've got so much work to do. I can't believe I signed up for that. And then you go on it and it's wonderful. And you
hmm,
say, that was the best thing I ever did, to sign up for that.
yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. Well, Tim, I do like to sometimes ask at the end if you could put into your own words what living a life of adventure means. How would you describe that?
I think it means a few things. One is an appreciation for the fact that you have one life to live
Hmm.
and limited time on this earth. And it is your choice on how you spend it. And that choice can be, I'm not going to take any risks. I'm going to stay in my house and watch television or get on social media or do whatever. Or I can choose to be outside in nature and doing something that is going to grow my appreciation, my sense of being, my place in the universe. my appreciation for that. So, to me, it is part of one's persona and self-knowledge to be out in the wilderness. And yeah, I think there's a sense of humility that comes with it.
Yeah.
To realize that you are a very small part of this incredibly diverse universe that we have. So yeah,
It's like the secret sauce that you get from pursuing something hard.
it is. And there's a great deal of satisfaction that comes along with it. You've got to sometimes tamp down the hubris that could come with it.
Yeah.
But for me, it's, hey, I'm out there in this wonderful world, and I'm only a small part of it. But I am fortunate to be able to experience it in all the vibrancy, the color, the cold, the hot, the wet, the dry, all of those things that actually come together to make a meaningful and memorable experience.
Yeah. All those things kind of remind us that we're fully human, right? And I can feel and experience every part that comes with it.
Yep, you got that right.
That's really cool.
Yep, I mean, to me, that's what it's all about. That's what life is all about. So although I did get a lot of professional satisfaction during my career, and I won't downplay that, but when I sit back and think of what the most memorable, enjoyable experiences I've had, they've all been outside in the outdoors
That's great.
and not sitting in an office
Yep.
or even on a ship.
That's
Yep.
fantastic. I think that's a good way to put a bow on it and bring the conversation into the dock. And Tim, I really appreciate you doing this, spending the last hour or so with me and recounting these life stories, but in a way that is inspiring, really. I love having these conversations to get to the why people do these things, not just about the thing that they do. And I think you did an excellent job of explaining why you pursue these hard things and what you get out of it. And so I'm very grateful that you spent the time to do this with me. And thank you very much.
You bet, Josh. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Very good.